Hey everyone, Andrews Holmes here. It is that time of the year. It is autumn or fall if you live in the United States. It is October month, or as I like to call it, Halloween month. Halloween is just around the corner, and I thought, what better way to celebrate than watch a bunch of horror films over this glorious month? That's right, I'm going to try and do 31 days of horror, so watch a horror film each day of this month. And with day one, I decided to start it off by watching the classic film that reignited the horror genre in the late part of the 90s, Wes Craven's Scream. Like, Scream for me is probably one of the best horror films ever made. I think, some people would say, there are better films, but, for what it does in reigniting the genre and, celebrating it and also trying to find new ways to bring it forward and make it seem a bit more fresh. And I think it succeeds in many different ways. And, it's fast, it's sharp, it's witty, it has a really unique voice and a lot of fun characters. And Kevin Williamson wrote an amazing script. And, he was inspired by house sitting, and he was watching a TV news program about the Gainesville Ripper in Florida, and he got the inspiration to write the screenplay of Scream, and he was a struggling writer, had to pay bills, and, he, out of desperation, he wrote a terrific screenplay that really just, brought the horror genre back from the dead, because in the 90s, no one was making horror movies. The horror genre was dead. Nightmare on Elm Street was finished, Friday the 13th was finished, the Halloween franchise was finished, and even Texas Chainsaw Massacre, they stopped making those movies. They weren't bringing in the big box office money. No studio was very interested in making horror films. There were a few exceptions, like Candyman, but really it just seemed like no one, the 80s was a huge period for slasher movies and, Halloween ripoffs and things like that, and they were really popular, and some of them were good, and some of them were a bit but the sort of thing to take away from it, they were all box office successes. Some were better than others, but they were all successful in their own way. But by the end of the 80s, I think people kind of lost a little bit of interest. The slasher film bubble had kind of burst. One of the genius things that the film does is it plays with the audience expectations, and it does it perfectly with the opening scene with Drew Barrymore. Drew Barrymore was one of the most well-known actresses at this time, and originally she was going to play the main character from what I found out in the behind-the-scenes documentary on the film, but she declined the role to play the opening girl who is hunted down by the Ghostface killer. And it was such a huge moment for the movie, and a huge surprise for the audience, because a lot of people went into this movie being like, "Wait, what? She's dead? I thought this was Drew Barrymore's film." The critic Mark Commode said on Bravo's 100 Scariest Movie Moments, if you want to open your horror film, that's how you do it. Drew Barrymore's performance in that opening is amazing. It's so you feel for her. You're with her the entire way in this helpless, terrifying situation, and it's so heartbreaking when she's brutally murdered at the beginning of the film, and it just sets the film off, and it just starts it in such a crazy and unique way, and it just gives the impression to the audience that anything can happen. You can expect a lot of things, but there are going to be some surprises down the line. Anything can happen, and what you think is going to happen could happen, but then again, something like this could happen. The scene itself is brilliantly choreographed. It starts off with the phone call. It's all innocent. The killer's like, "Who's this?" And she's like, "Oh, who are you calling?" and stuff like that. But as the scene goes on, it starts to get more kinetic. The camera work is not as smooth. I love the use of the popcorn as a way of building up tension. It starts to get more and more inflamed, and the situation gets more chaotic, and Drew Barrymore just starts falling to pieces and seeing her boyfriend being gutted in front of her, and it's such a real heartbreaking moment, and it's so terrifying as well, and you're just there going get the fuck out of the house, run woman, run. If that beginning scene didn't work, the whole film wouldn't have kept the interest of the audience. Because that scene worked so well, and it was just such a real what the fuck, it just kept the audience in there, and they were like, I want to see more, I want to see where this is going. The movie's central mystery is pretty gripping. The killer could be anybody. You you're sitting there suspecting, oh, it could be him, or it could be her, or it could be him, or it could be you, or something like that. It's got layers. It's not your simple hack and slash like most of the Friday the 13th sequels that have all these various characters who get killed off by Jason in various different ways, and you don't really get a chance to really know them. And in this film, you really get a sense of who these characters are before the carnage happens. And I think that's a really good idea when you're writing a horror screenplay, to not kill them off quickly. I mean, they did it with Drew Barrymore, but they gave her a good chance for the audience to be invested in her situation, and that was helped by Kevin Williams' writing, the directing, and also Drew Barrymore's flawless performance. Neve Campbell is brilliant as Sidney Prescott. She's so wonderful, and she plays Sidney in such a really innocent and damaged way, and you really feel for her situation. She's very similar to Nancy from Nightmare on Elm Street, who was played by Heather Langenkamp. Like, both of these characters are victims, and have struggled with the situation that they've been put in, but they find the courage to stand up and fight for their own survival. And I think that was quite a cool thing to see. Like, she's got a real cool Sarah Connor Ripley feel about her towards the end of the film, when she's like had enough and willing to fight back and stop running. Skeet Ulrich, who plays Billy Loomis, Sidney Prescott's very horny and extremely attractive boyfriend. Probably the role that he's most known for, and he's actually really good in this film, and it's no coincidence that he looks exactly like Johnny Depp, because they're playing off the Nancy and Glenn relationship from Nightmare on Elm Street, and I feel like that reference was something that was quite fun to see, and I think fans of the horror genre would be really quick to notice that. But, they didn't pick him because he looked exactly like Johnny Depp and they wanted to reference that, but they picked him because he's really good and very capable, and actually, he's very good in this role, and, it's a shame he never, went further than most of the cast members of this film. Like I mentioned before, there were a lot of films that came out in the 80s that follow the success and guidelines of John Carpenter's Halloween, like My Bloody Valentine, Happy Birthday to Me, Prom Night, Silent Night, Deadly Night, Friday the 13th. Like, all these movies, they all had various amounts of success, and some were good, some were bad, some were a bit like, okay, that's not for me. And Scream, kind of did the same thing that Halloween did. It, reignited the horror genre. People were really interested in doing horror films. Like, studios were willing to back horror films, kind of like now with the success of It and Get Out and It Comes at Night. Like, horror is kind of coming back in a big, bad way. Like, I mean, look at all the countless Stephen King adaptations that are coming out on Netflix, like 1922 and Gerald's Game, which is, pretty cool. Like, some horror films these days, they're often played too serious, and they don't have these moments of levity where, some human moments happen, or like little moments of comedy. Like, it's, it doesn't let the audience breathe a little bit. It just keeps throwing a lot of horror and seriousness at it. That's kind of like, what one of the sort of negative aspects of the Saw films and some horror remakes. Like, Scream had these really nice human moments. Like, it deals with trauma and, this concept of if it bleeds, it leads, which is personified by Courtney Cox's scene-stealing performance of Gale Weathers. And, it just really taps into, like, some sort of real-life aspects that people could relate to and, enjoy to see on the screen. This movie really is a classic. It's fun. It still holds up most than other horror films that came out in that sort of period. Like, it's kind of fun to see that, while they were making this film, a lot of studios were like, I don't know, this doesn't seem like the film for us, and some people didn't think it was going to be as successful, and who was going to go see this movie. And like, while they were in post-production on this film, they got an NC-17 rating. They had to send it back to be recut and all this stuff. And, you got to tip your hat to the Weinstein brothers, who called up the MPAA and like said to Wes Craven, I got your R. And Wes Craven was like, how the hell did you do that? And then Bob Weinstein was like, I told him it was a comedy, because the film is a comedy and a horror film, but it's also a satire on the horror genre. Like, it makes fun of all those elements that you see in horror films. Like, there's a scene with Sidney Prescott where she's talking to the killer, and she's like, well, what's the point of horror films? They're all the same. It's about a killer who's stalking a big-breasted girl who can act when should be running outside instead of running upstairs. It's insulting. And then falling into that scenes later. Like, it's respecting the genre and making fun of it, but also trying new things to entice and scare the audience. Like directors like George A. Romero, Tobe Hooper, John Carpenter, Dario Argento, all of these directors are fantastic and real great horror directors, and Wes Craven is up there with them. And I really think he was a very underrated director. Like, he was really trying to do something different when he was making horror films, like trying to add substance to them. Like Nightmare on Elm Street, when it came out during the sort of boom of slasher films, it wasn't trying to be like, you know, like Friday the 13th or Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It was trying to, you know, do something a little bit different, like make something very like scary and real and something that could really tap into your psychosis. And I think that's, you know, he really tried to do that with his films. And you could, you know, it seemed like he was really fighting a lot with studios over his vision, and you can kind of see that in some of his films. Like, he had to kind of compromise, but when, you know, they found like more like a sort of ground where they could all agree on, then he was able to, you know, do what he wanted to do. And I he's one of my favorite directors, and it's a shame he's not around making more films. And you know, it's great that he was able to be with the same cast members for Scream 2 and Scream 3 and then Scream 4, which I thought was, you know, pretty good and ended the, you know, that franchise pretty well. And, you know, they did plan to do other films afterwards, but I think they ended it quite well there, because I feel like with that kind of idea and concept for a horror film, it, you know, risks getting a little bit stale. And the TV show, which airs on MTV, and they're about to do their third season, it doesn't quite get there. I mean, it has elements that I like, and some of the actors in them are pretty good, but there's nothing really there to really just grip me and want me to, you know, really care about what's going on. It's basically just like, I don't know, it's just a bit too much teen angst for my liking. When you think of Wes Craven, two films spring to mind: Nightmare on Elm Street and this film. And Wes Craven did an amazing thing. He reinvented the horror genre twice. Like, which director can say that they did that? That's pretty cool. So I was very happy to start 31 Days of Horror with this film. And if you haven't seen Scream, I would highly recommend checking it out, and also checking out the sequels, because they're actually pretty good and they really expand on what came in the first film. And it would have been nice if Kevin Williamson stayed on as a screenwriter, because Scream 3 suffers from his voice not being on the page and on the screen in that film. But it was nice that he came back for Scream 4 in some sort of capacity. And if you have seen Scream, do watch it again, because it still holds up and it's still a fun ride. It gets better every time when I watch it.